Welcome to the latest Seahawks Draft Blog live stream. Rob Staton and Jeff Simmons with us again here today to discuss what is a crucial off-season for the Seahawks. Got some big topics to get into today. So let's get into it, Jeff. I think really the whole starting point of this off-season is going to come down to what happens at the quarterback position. And first and foremost, what the Seahawks are going to do with Geno Smith. So we had a Brady Henderson article last week that suggested the Seahawks were quite comfortable with the situation, that ultimately, if the price gets too high, they'll move on. They feel like the scheme is quarterback friendly, and that they have other options they can turn to. And then on the day of the 49ers game, we all of a sudden have Ian Rappaport reporting the exact opposite thing, that essentially Geno Smith will definitely be back with the Seahawks, that they would be willing to use the franchise tag if needs be, which would guarantee him, I think it's something like $32 million, $32.4 million next season on a guaranteed 1-year contract, which I think, given that he's never had more in a contract than he had in the last season with Seattle, he would probably sign that within about 30 seconds of the tag being thrown on him. So we have all of that talk. We then have, Geno saying he kind of wants to stay around, and Pete saying they've got their guy. I was listening to KJ Wright on Brock and Salt today saying he wouldn't pay more than $20 million and wondering which of the teams would actually be competition for him that's going to drive the price up. So what's going to happen with Geno Smith? What's your prediction, and what would you like them to do?
Well, I have the same read as you. That Brady Henderson article to me was really interesting. And Brady, if you've read his stuff, is pretty close, I think, with the front office of the Seahawks. So I think a lot of stuff he gets, I would guess, come from there. He's become a really good reporter. So I think they do have a ceiling on what they're willing to pay him. And if you look at like the free agent class coming up, there's not like Lamar Jackson. I don't know if he'll become actually available, or Tom Brady. I don't think those are realistic options. But there's like kind of guys who are at his sort of career level. There's like a Sam Darnold, or a guy like Gardner Minshew, who was kind of Geno last year or something like that. But I do think internally the Seahawks would be comfortable. I think from the front office level, I think they have a ceiling. I think there's a price point they're willing to pay. And if he wants to cash in on the season, which if I was his camp, I'd probably be looking to do too, then there might be a struggle in the negotiation. Ultimately, I think they'll end up franchising him, because I don't know if they'll come to a number. But I do not think they'll end up playing at that franchise. I think the worst thing the Seahawks could do would have him play at the franchise number, because as you've said many times in your work, if you have $32 million on one player, 31.5, there goes your entire offseason. You can't upgrade the team, and you're basically left in the same situation they were with Russell. And it's why they've become this mediocre team, because they had all that money, and then the emphasis becomes on drafting. But this team needs more than a draft. They need to upgrade with veteran players as well. And so ultimately, I do think they'll come to some sort of 3-year deal or a 4-year deal that might look a little bad up front, but I think they'll probably have a year one cap hit that will be easy to stomach, and they'll probably have it out by year 3. I don't know if that's the best situation that the Seahawks can be in, but ultimately, based on the reporting and based on how Geno played in the playoff game, I think that's where it'll end up.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating situation. I generally think that people who have been talking about this in the media have just not done enough homework on this situation as to what this is all about. I see people just saying glibly, well, you've got loads of cap space, for example, so you can afford to pay him, $35 million a year. The franchise doesn't matter. The franchise tag doesn't matter and stuff like that. I think the reason that you franchise him is because you ultimately want to keep him away from the market. That's the only reason why. And then as soon as you've tagged him, the negotiations have to start, because he will sign that tag. So you tag him, you say, right, you are stuck. The absolute minimum is you're with us next year on this 1-year deal. Now, if you want to screw the team and not have a supporting cast to help you be a better player and earn even more money, then you need to come to an agreement with us, which allows us to lower your year one cap hit. That is the only situation, and that will play out. I don't think there's any danger whatsoever that if it even came to that they wouldn't be able to work something out which would lower his cap hit. My biggest worry would be, what does that mean for the long term? Because if you franchise him, the average salary is set at $32.4 million as an average for the rest of the contract that he's going to be in Seattle. So if you wanted to get that down to, I don't know, 20, then that means you're probably going to be looking at a cap hit, which is a lot more than 32.4 million in 2024 or 2025. So that becomes fractious. I suspect that what will happen, Jeff, I'm not sure that the franchise tag is going to be necessary. I thought that what you just said, I would have agreed with probably a week ago. Now, what I think will happen is I think they'll get to the combine when all of the agents and the teams have their illegal but nobody cares tampering period in Indianapolis. I think they will establish what Geno's market is then. And then I think the Seahawks will know and Geno Smith will know what is the kind of deal that is going to get this done. I have no idea what the number will be, but I would imagine that before that deadline for the franchise tag comes, we will probably see a contract extension. But I do find it interesting. I do think the Brady Henderson article is sourced from Seattle's front office, and I think it was negotiating through the media. Hey, listen, if you don't want to sign, we'll go and get somebody else. This scheme's great. Pete did a bit of that as well this week by saying he knows this is the best place for him, which was a bit of a pointed message that, why would you want to go and play for, I don't know, the Jets or the Falcons or something when you've just had a career season? One thing I do find very interesting, though, and it is the Drew Lock factor of this, Jeff, is that they've had this other quarterback who they keep saying that they like, and it's probably going to be available at a price that's probably even cheaper the contract that Geno Smith has just had. And they clearly talked up Lock, and we don't really know what they really think of Drew Lock. But when you actually think back to it, this is a player who had fantastic physical qualities. I mean, we can talk, and we will talk, no doubt, about the Levises and the Strouds and the Richardsons that are available in this draft. Drew Lock jumped to a 31-inch vertical, ran a 4.69 40, and had a 4.12 short shuttle. He's an elite athlete. I don't know if you saw the video that the Seahawks posted of him shooting basketball against a couple of other people this season. He's effing brilliant at basketball. Like, the guy is a fantastic athlete. Lance Zierlein graded him as a 6.40 and gave Patrick Mahomes a 6.30 when he was doing his draft grade. So at least one person who is respected within the business thought that Drew Lock was a better prospect than Patrick Mahomes. It just makes me wonder a little bit, if the price did get too high, whether they'd just go, do you know what, screw it, we're just going to see if we can make Drew Lock Geno Smith. And quite frankly, Jeff, as we sit here right now, I kind of think, well, if they ended up with that, if Drew Lock ended up being your bridge quarterback to the future, or your attempt at that, is anybody going to be? I mean, there will be, because there's a real throng of fans who seem to love Geno. But are we really going to be crying over the fact that they moved on and tried to recreate what they did this year with Geno Smith?
There will definitely be a group that's upset. Seahawks Twitter, as you know very well, I think no matter what they do, there's going to be a group of someone upset about something. Yeah, Drew Lock, I think all indications are that Schneider in the front office really like this guy. And I don't think it was just trying to PR. I think they wanted him as a flyer. And I think Rob, you've done a great job talking about this. And I noticed this when I wrote an article out this week going through the cap. A lot of their contracts were set up this year to take on a rookie quarterback. And Will Dissly and Quandre Diggs specifically had giant jumps in year 2. And if you look at how Jamal Adams' contract, and even Pete said it the other day, they asked, I can't remember if it was the Salk interview or if it was his press conference, where he was way more honest than usual. He even said, someone asked him about rookie quarterbacks, and he said basically, they didn't expect Geno or to kind of play at this level, and they were kind of planning something differently. So I think they looked at Drew Lock as a flyer. I was told early in the year that the front office was a little taken back that Pete announced Geno as the starter after that third preseason game where Lock was a disaster. I think the front office, this is where the front office and coaches are going to butt heads, because I think the front office probably sitting there and they would love to have that in their back pocket in the Geno negotiation. The tricky thing is, I bet you the coaches would go crazy. And Lock is a guy, he's got all the traits you want. He's got the arm strength. He can move. He's an athlete. The things he struggled with are some of the things that Geno was really good at this year. He's not the smartest player. Geno got really good at the line of scrimmage this year. And Geno would go playing in San Francisco. I don't know if you could throw Drew Lock into that situation where he's not great reading the line of scrimmage. He's even more turnover heavy than Geno is. And We saw him like when he played in the preseason against Pittsburgh. They ultimately lost that game because Drew didn't see something at the line of scrimmage. He missed the blitz pickup. So I think from the front office perspective, they really would. But man, that's a hard sell to your locker room. I think that's a tough sell, and it's going to be really tricky because like all things being equal, and all things are not equal, and we can talk about that later. But all things being equal, the best case scenario would be to draft the quarterback and move on from both. Then you can spend your $32 million on the rest of the team, but there's so many complicating factors and so many other factors I'm sure we want to talk about. But to me, that would be the best scenario if there were none of these other factors.
I have got something to pitch to you later, Jeff, and I'm not saying that I will agree with this pitch that I'm going to throw your way, but I'm interested to know what your answer is, and it is related to a strategy for the offseason. But I'm going to come back to that in a bit. A lot of people are commenting and some are asking questions. If you want to chuck in a live chat, whether it's a question or a statement, we will put them up on the screen. We will address them as soon as possible. We'll come to them straight away. But we're going to stick to super chats for answering questions. So on that whole point, I think you were right, Jeff, about how the coaches would react, and maybe there is a bit of a different feeling. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes, it's okay for a front office and a coaching staff to disagree on something, and actually it not be like World War II. I mean, they can just have different takes on things and still come to an agreement and accept a compromise situation and move forward. I just think with this offseason, what we've got here, and this is going to sound more negative than I'm perhaps mean it to, but I kind of feel like the having a better season than everybody expected is good to some extent and bad in others. So there was somebody tweeting at me yesterday saying that the Seahawks are closer than everybody thinks, and that actually they're just a couple of pieces away from being a legit contender. And I don't know how anybody can voice that opinion, but when you've won 9 games and you've played in the playoffs, it's easy for people to be persuaded that is the reality. When the reality is that the Seahawks have had one of the weakest schedules in the NFL and won 9 games. And when you actually just put them alongside Detroit, who could easily have finished in the playoffs in the end, I think the Lions would have given the Niners a much better game than Seattle did last week. And that's granted, that is with Seattle being leading at halftime, and it was only a 6-point game at the end of the third quarter. But that's just my personal opinion. The Lions looked like they had roaring momentum, no pun intended, going into that sort of the end of the season, in a way that maybe Seattle and others did not. But that's by the by. So it creates maybe a sense of Seattle being closer than they are, when maybe the reality should be this is just year 2 of a rebuild. And then the other thing is it means that you are suddenly in this place because Geno Smith has played above expectations, that you have to wrestle with the idea of paying him a contract that is similar to the one that you just removed from your salary when Russell Wilson went to Denver. And the benefits of moving on from Wilson was supposed to be a cheaper contract. You mentioned it. I think the front office set it up to have a cheap contract at quarterback next season. If you then pay Geno Smith for essentially 1 good season, you're losing that entire benefit, and you are perhaps going in a direction that is not productive with a rebuild, Jeff. You are saying we're going to try and win now, essentially, or we're going to pay a lot of money for a quarterback who, with respect, since Germany, has not played that well, has played okay, but has had a lot of turnovers. And again, it turns you in a different direction. If the Seahawks had finished with 5 wins and Geno Smith had been pretty crap, everyone would have been on board with draft a quarterback, do this, do that. We know it's year 2. It is what it is. But instead, we're kind of torn a little bit between how good are they, who are you keeping, how much are you spending to keep them, and you're a little bit in the middle. And that means there's going to be some big decisions needed, and I would suggest to you some bold decisions made and some honest and brutal decisions made by this team coming up in the next few weeks.
Yeah, and adding to that, like, had they won, if Drew Lock played all year, like, they probably win what? With that defense, they probably win what, 3 games? Maybe. Geno was the reason they were like, how he just, not just Geno, but the way he elevated the rest of the offense. So instead of having the 20th pick, you might have 2 top 5 picks. And that would completely change your direction. So, yeah, I could not agree with you more. This is not an easy situation because I know they had a great rookie class and they are ascending as a roster. But I can't emphasize this is the most important offseason they've had in a number of years because it's exactly what you said, Rob. Because they overachieved a bit, it made their situation a little trickier. They have the Geno valuation alone is one of the tougher valuations I can remember in the league because of I can't think of another 32-year-old career backup that broke out and now you have to pay it. So doing that evaluation when, as you said, the numbers got a lot worse. And he played awful in that Rams game to end the season. He was a lot better in the San Francisco game. That first half, I thought he played really, really well. It was sort of a microcosm of the season because he turned the ball over and he wasn't nearly as effective in the second half. But yeah, if Seattle doesn't get this right or they make the wrong decision, this could completely change the course of their franchise. I think this offseason, it's fascinating to see what they do with Geno, but I think it's so important because after this year, yeah, they're going to have more cap room. They're going to have the same draft capital as most other teams. There's no real other. So this offseason itself, whether it's the quarterback decision, whether it's the draft, it sets the tone of whether this thing keeps ascending or whether they just become one of those teams that's constantly in the top 10. So I know I've been one who's pushing that they are ascending, they're getting better, but if they get this offseason wrong, where this is the last of the Russell Wilson capital, if they make the wrong decision on Geno and they're stuck having to pay dead money to get rid of that, or they're stuck not being able to upgrade in other areas. Yeah, you make a good point that maybe we look back and say maybe it's bad they overachieved. Maybe they would have been better off just sticking on that path, which is why I say all things being equal, I think drafting the quarterback is the cleanest way to move forward. I don't know if it'll happen because it just seems like they've probably internally decided that Geno is the guy for and I think, like you said, he is the perfect bridge quarterback. I don't think they could be looking at him as a franchise quarterback. I think that's the thing that will get you into mistakes because I think he's the kind of player, we've seen it. He needs everything around him to be working, to get the value out of him. And when the offensive line started breaking down and when Kenneth Walker was struggling, we saw Geno wasn't very effective. And when everything was working, like the first half of the Niners game, you saw what Geno can do. That's what you want him to be. But when he had to play from behind and when the run game went away with Ken Walker was on the sidelines, there's a turnover problem. So, yeah, I don't know what they're going to do. I don't know what the number they're going to come up with. But, yeah, you can't emphasize what you're saying enough. Like this offseason will set the course for their next few years because the amount of capital, the amount of resources they could have, if they get that wrong, they're going to be looking at a long, long rebuild.
Ideal situation for me, Jeff, will be to sign Geno Smith to a contract that is not too bad. You know, I don't think we have to go as low as 20 million, what KJ Wright was suggesting, but maybe not as high as 30 either, maybe somewhere in the middle, maybe. But the potential to perhaps have him as a bridge and draft a quarterback early. And I love I know it's not guaranteed to work out that way. I just love what Kansas City did. They had Alex Smith. They developed Mahomes for a year, and they decided after a year that Mahomes was ready. Now, if Seattle drafts a quarterback, and after 1 year they think we'd rather stick with Geno Smith, let's say he has a similar season to the one he's just had, maybe even a little better, you could say we're going to give him another year. And then at the age 35, you maybe turn it over. You would still have 3 very cheap years of a quarterback contract for drafting in the top 5. The cap hit's never going to be more than sort of $7 or $8 million. And you could then maybe trade Geno Smith to a team that is looking for somebody who wants a veteran quarterback, or maybe even wants a bridge, like Washington were looking for when they traded for Alex Smith. And the Chiefs got a 3rd-round pick and a player out of that trade. And it's better than a kick in the balls. So, you know, I think that is a plan that would work for Seattle and that I think is really good. What I don't understand are the people saying you can't possibly even consider drafting a quarterback because Geno Smith's going to be good for the next 5 years, because you just can't assume that. And the other thing that I would say is that I think this is a really interesting point that is worth mentioning. Here's a note on Ryan Tannehill's contract that I read in an article this week. So in the years that followed, Tennessee, this is after Tannehill's contract was signed, Tennessee had to restructure Tannehill's deal twice, extending what was supposed to be a 3-year commitment into one that's now past 4. But the Titans haven't won a playoff game since Tannehill put pen to paper. So since he signed, Tannehill came in, had an impact, he signed a big new contract. Playoff wins since, 0. Now, it might not be just because they've paid Ryan Tannehill, but it goes to show that when he signed that contract, I don't think anybody was screaming from the rooftop saying what a terrible deal or an idea it was for the Titans. I think they just got to the AFC Championship game with him. Obviously, he was supported well by Derrick Henry and AJ Brown, but it just goes to show that you could make a big commitment to Geno Smith, and you get a tougher schedule next year. You might find that it's just a load of wasted money that you could have spent elsewhere, and perhaps is where we should progress now, Jeff, to what you would like to see the Seahawks do elsewhere, because we've just heard Pete Carroll do two very honest press conferences, press media sessions, where he talked about how far behind the Niners they were, that they needed a lot of work, that they were quite a way behind. I personally don't think, even if you spent your first 4 picks on the draft, that you are going to elevate your defense, probably even within 2 years, to a level that you sort of kind of want it to be just from draft picks alone. I think there has to be an injection of proven quality as well. And I've written an article and this is what I'm going to pitch to you in a minute. If you actually look at the top teams in the NFL, they've all done it. Whether it was the Bills with Von Miller, whether it was the Niners with Trent Williams, the Chargers with Corey Linsley, Joe Tooney with the Chiefs, but they also traded for Orlando Brown and for Frank Clark. I'm trying to remember more off the top of my head, but pretty much everybody's made a deal. The Bills traded for Stephon Diggs, signed Von Miller. So all of the top teams have either hit on a free agent or have made a big trade that there's been a splash and it's worked. So do the Seahawks need, the first part of this is, do the Seahawks need to be more aggressive in free agency, if possible, to go and land somebody? And there's not great options out there, it has to be said. There's no Von Miller out there. But do they have to be a bit more aggressive in the veteran market as well as the draft market to upgrade on defense? Does it have to go hand in hand? Surely, Jeff, they can't just go out there, look for a $5 million defensive end who's 29 years old and has got a career best of like 4 sacks. Surely now, and it can't just be like, hey, Quentin Jefferson played for us and Bruce Irvin played for us before, let's bring him back. Surely it has to be, they've got to go and get some studs who can go and play up front.
Yeah, you couldn't be more in line with your take there. Adding to that, like the Bengals signed Trey Hendrickson. He's another guy who they had a great success with.
And DJ Reader.
Yeah, DJ Reader. So the Bengals
and they rebuilt their O-line last year.
Yeah, and last year. So the Bengals are a team like when there's all this talk like, well, don't draft the quarterback 5 because you don't have the team around it. Like you've heard that talk around, right? You'd be wasting the quarterback. And the Bengals are the team I keep going back to. When they drafted Joe Burrow, their roster was pretty thin. They had Joe Mixon, they had Tyler Boyd, and they've really done a good job building it not only through the draft, but through free agency. And over time, they've signed DJ Reader, Trey Hendrickson, offensive line, Mike Hilton, the corner, and they've complemented really well, which has put them on the Super Bowl trajectory. They were in the Super Bowl year 2, but I don't think you can just come out and expect the team. Like if you want to see a team, like the Jets are a team that they've drafted really well the last couple of years. Obviously, they haven't hit on the quarterback, but there are those gaps, and especially with defensive linemen, there's not a lot of guys who hit the thing like Nick Bosa or some of the guys like even like Dexter Lawrence, who was maybe the best player in the field in this game. It took him a couple of years to really become this impact guy. And Dexter Lawrence, Daniel Jones got all the talk. Dexter Lawrence was the best player in the field last week. But there's not a lot of Micah Parsons who just hit the ground running. It's a position that takes time. So defensive tackle, especially, like you're going up against grown men in the interior. Like I think defensive tackle is a spot they really got to look at in free agency. And I think there's some interesting ones in the draft. And we paid Jalen Carter all we want, and there are concerns there. And even the Baylor guy, Siaki Ika, he's a monster. But even a guy like Vita Vea, like couldn't be as big and strong as that guy. It took them a couple of years to figure it out. And I think they need to mix that. And we saw it last year. The Seahawks finally made a slightly aggressive free agent move with Uchenna Nwosu. And it worked. Like, these are the kind of players that me and you have been begging the team for years to try to buy low on players, to try to get guys at the right ages. Don't do these Benson Mayoa, Greg Olsen. And how bad did all that work? And they finally paid for a 25-year-old player, probably their best player on defense this year. And they hit. And I don't know if Daron Payne is going to hit free agency. I don't know if Javon Hargrave But I think the Seahawks they're not going to be able to build a defense like San Francisco. Like Nick Bosa is like a generational talent. Buckner's a hard guy to get. They also have those linebackers. What Seattle needs is guys who can tackle Deebo Samuel, guys who can tackle McCaffrey. So not only do they need defensive linemen, and that could come in the draft, but I think they really got to look to complement what they can do in the draft with veteran free agents, and I think they need quality ones. I don't think they can just ruffle around the edges. I think defensive tackle is a spot where maybe you move on from Quinton Jefferson, maybe you move on even from Shelby Harris if it's going to open up money. And the article on the cap article on your site was great, and that's where I was thinking about it, where if they can maybe open up Shelby Harris's money, and you can spend that pretty aggressively. That's, I think, $8-9 million. That can be most of your year one cap hit on a Javon Hargrave or Daron Payne, or even Fletcher Cox is out there. He's a little older, but I don't think you can go out there and just assume you plug rookies in and you're fixed, like especially on the defensive line. And if you look at the linebacker group is pretty good. There's a bunch of like 26 to 27-year-old players in free agency where I don't know if you want to retain Cody Barton, but that's a spot too. That team has been so bad at tackling. Like a proven linebacker might not be a bad thing to spend on this year.
So this brings me on to the second part, and I just want to get through these two super chats first because they've been in there for a while. Slacker Hero says this was Geno's ceiling. He's a 33-year-old journeyman. The Broncos pick was a gift in a good QB class. Just take a QB and set yourself up with a rookie pay scale contract for 5 years. Don't get cute. Slacker Hero, thank you for your super chat and for your support. There is another one that has jumped in. I'll just find it. MSM Mock had Carter, Levis, 1 and 2, Stroud for us. There are. Thank you for your super chat take 6 to 10. There are a lot of mock drafts out at the moment, and some of them are a bit strange. Especially the one on The Athletic that was published this week. And Kevin says, if there was a trade down to get Tyree Wilson, at what pick would you be truly comfortable value position to snag him? It seems a stretch to stay and take at 5. I think it depends on how he tests, because there probably isn't another human being with his body on the planet. So if he comes out and blows up the combine, I think you do have to consider him possibly at 5 because his upside would be incredible. But I am a little leery of Big 12 defenders. There's not been a lot of them that have come into the NFL recently, and his tape is inconsistent. So, I mean, Jim Nagy said top 10. I think top 10 is fine, more 10 to 15. But in a draft without a lot of top 10 picks, maybe he's gonna go in the top 10. So this brings me on to the thing I wanted to pitch to you, Jeff, and I'm going to write an article about this. In fact, it's already written. It's ready to go. I'm probably going to stick it out on Friday. So let's acknowledge that they need some veteran talent. Now, whether they take Jalen Carter at number 5, let's just say, or a quarterback, I think this idea is worth considering and has benefits for both things. You have got pick 20. You've got a pick in the early second round, and you've got a pick in the late second round. Now, I freaking hate the idea of another crap veteran trade, but I'm going to suggest one anyway for the purpose of a conversation about this, because nobody else has really talked about this, and I want to get your idea on it. I don't think reading what has been said by the Washington Commanders GM that Daron Payne is going to be allowed to hit the market. I think he had a career year, 11.5 sacks, incredible for a defensive tackle. 18 TFLs, third most in the league. You cannot let a guy like that walk. He's 25. He's not 26 till later in this year. I think it's May or something. So they're going to franchise him for $18.9 million. But they've paid Jonathan Allen. They're going to have to pay Montez Sweat, and they may want to pay Chase Young if he can get healthy again. They're going to cut Carson Wentz, which would free up the money to re-sign Daron Payne. But at the same time, I think all options have to be open. And based on what Daron Payne's been saying, he just wants to get paid. And I don't think he gives a crap about staying in Washington. Jonathan Allen signed there because he's from Washington. Lives down the road from the stadium. So, a bit different. Would you consider trading, if he is franchised, for Daron Payne? It'd be expensive. It might be your first pick in round 2, for example, to go and get him. But would you do it? Because what you do get then is a veteran, proven sack specialist, tackle for a loss specialist, fits the scheme, hard-nosed, explosive, quick defender, ran a 4.90 at 310 pounds. You get him in at a great age. You could sign him to a 4-year contract. He'll be 30 when that runs out. There's a chance for a third contract there if you wanted to. Imagine having Jalen Carter and Deron Payne on your defensive line next year. That's a front three. That is something that can scare opponents. Jalen Carter on his own, or next to Shelby Harris and Al Woods, seems underwhelming to me. It seems like, you're putting a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, really. I think it's you need a bit more than that. Put Payne and Carter together. It's very good. But if you take a quarterback at 5, Jeff, it also means that you aren't missing out on some impact defenders up front. So if you take your quarterback and then you get Deron Payne at the top of round 2, let's say with your high second round pick, you have got a good, young, quality defensive lineman, and you've got your quarterback of the future. You'd have to pay Deron Payne $20 million a year. But hey, you're paying Jamal Adams and Quandre Diggs near enough $20 million a year. So I don't know. What do you think? Again, I don't like the idea of big veteran trades because the scars from Graham and Harvin and Adams are there. But what do you make of this suggestion?
Well, you just made my point. The thing I've been saying for years is if you're going to trade for players from other teams, get them at the line of scrimmage. Like the one thing that's been bothering me, you mentioned all 3 of them. Graham was a tight end that couldn't block. Percy Harvin was a gadget player. And Jamal Adams is essentially a gadget player on defense. If you look at some of the big defensive players that have been traded, like Von Miller, what he did for the Rams last year, if I can get Deron Payne the second round pick, I would do it. I know there's people who would go crazy about that because of the cost of what a second round pick would cost for the next 4 years versus giving that up and paying them. But to me, those defensive linemen are as rare to find as quarterbacks. And we've seen it almost throughout this entire regime. They haven't had a lot of guys like this. Like getting Averill and Ben in free agency was so lucky, and the prices they got were so unbelievable. But Deron Payne's a 25-year-old stud in the middle of the defensive line. And I think the cool thing was it's exactly what you said. It opens up a lot of luxury and flexibility with that pick 5. And if you end up with Jalen Carter, you've now created a massive position of strength at your biggest weak spot. And I just think players like Deron Payne are super rare and they don't hit free agency. And if they franchise tag them, you see the drop-off in quality and talent. These big defensive tackles, and you look at like DJ Reader's a guy that's done really well in Cincinnati, and that's the kind of player we've been saying Seattle's been needing to sign. And those are the kind of players I actually would feel comfortable trading for. Like the Giants traded for Leonard Williams a few years ago. I think it was a 3rd-round pick they gave, and they paid him $20 million a year or something. And like everyone talks about Brian Dable, and rightfully so, but they have 3 top 20 picks in their defensive line. Dexter Lawrence, Leonard Williams, and Thibodeau. That makes a huge difference. Seattle doesn't have one player drafted in the top 15 on their team other than Bruce Irvin, who's 35 and probably shouldn't be playing at this point in his career. So, yeah, he's a guy I would trade for. I know some people would absolutely hate that just because of the cost difference and just drafting a guy in the second round. But to me, guys like that are hard to find. They're rare, and they can change your ceiling. And they have so much other draft capital. I think I'd be okay with that because they still have 2 1s, a 2, and you can still move down some of those spots to recoup some of those picks. So if you move down from 20 after that, for example, maybe get a second back. So I am or move down from 5, you could get a future 1 potentially. So I would do that very quickly. The ideal scenario would be to be able to sign them. But I just think guys like that, you can't just plug in rookies at defensive line. You see it with Cincinnati. You've seen it in Buffalo. You've seen it in Kansas City. They traded for Frank Clark. They won the Super Bowl the next year. They paid Chris Jones. Like it took Chris Jones a couple of years. San Francisco, they've been able to get guys left and right. But all these teams, the Giants, you saw their defensive line. That's the position group I would be comfortable trading for, especially defensive tackle that's kind of Alabama, like blue collar. Like that's a guy that's just so hard to get. And to me, I would do that trade.
I just think whenever the league year opens, you see a tweet from Schefter or Rappaport or whoever, Seahawks have traded number 38, I think it is, or whatever, for Deron Payne. I'm getting a cigar out, putting my feet up, looking forward to that number 5 pick because you can't go wrong. because either way, you're going to win. If Jalen Carter or Will Anderson are there at number 5, great. You've just set up 2 stud players for your defensive front. If those players are gone, or if you prefer to take a quarterback, you've got your quarterback for the future, and you've got a stud defensive lineman. You can't lose. Like it takes all the pressure off the draft before you've even got, you're still nearly 2 months away from the draft, and you've sold, or just about 6 weeks away from the draft, and already you've put a great big tick in one box by getting a proven quality defensive lineman at a good age. For me, it's a win-win, and I'd seriously consider it. And look, I'm going to produce a mock draft tomorrow, because I've been promising one for a few weeks, and I kept delaying it because I either wasn't happy with the darn thing, or I was waiting for something to materialize, like CJ Stroud declaring or the Seahawks season finishing. And I'll give a bit of a spoiler alert, Jeff, that I'm going to put a linebacker at Drew Sanders at number 20. And the reason is because I think that, when I was listening to Carroll the other day, he was saying they need impact. They need players who can get, aggressive, attack-minded players. And the one thing about Drew Sanders is he's a very good athlete. He's got good size and he can get bigger. He's 6'5", 230. He could probably play at 240. Very quick, flies to the ball carrier. He had 9.5 sacks last year, and he can play conventional linebacker when he did for Arkansas, but he can play off the edge in sub packages and stuff like that, a bit like a poor man's Micah Parsons. So I was thinking, okay, you put, if you did go Carter 5, you've then got Carter, Payne, and Sanders, who are like, all of a sudden you're going into a game thinking, we could get after a team. And if it's not Carter, and if it's a quarterback, you think, okay, you've got Payne, you've got Sanders. And like, what else can you add? Where can you go and get a defensive lineman with your second round pick or a third round pick? There are some very athletic, dynamic, 3 technique types that are going to be in this draft. You all of a sudden you're building a team that you can think, yeah, do you know what? This is building off that 2022 draft. This is the second phase of this. And you either come out of it, Jeff, with a great D-line for the future, and you feel good about that, or you come out of it with an improved D-line and a quarterback. Tell me that doesn't sound good. I mean, that sounds good, doesn't it? That's every single fan who is a Seahawks fan should be able to say either of those scenarios, I'm down with that, I think.
It's 100%. And you watch this team, they have like the speed and the flash, which is funny, we've talked about for years, but they don't have like the guts. They don't have the guts of this team. Their weakness is the line of scrimmage on both sides, the interior of the line. They got the 2 tackles who are more pass blocking, but they don't have those dominant physical guys. And they don't have, like, their best defensive linemen are probably Al Woods and Shelby Harris. And those are complementary players at best. So nothing against those guys. Those guys are playing really, really well, but they're not building blocks. And to go into a situation where you could add 3 building blocks and guys at the right, what I like about Payne too, he's the right age. He's ascending. He's getting better. And that's like the sweet spot for defensive line. That's when you're playing your best football. It's not like running back where they fall off a cliff right after that age point. That's exactly when they've had their man strength. And man, it would be just it's the thing I keep saying. Like, you're not going to build a defense like San Francisco. It's just probably not realistic. You're not going to build what they had in the first 3-5 years of this program. You're not going to get 8 Pro Bowlers on a defense in the next 2 years. What you have to do is you have to create positions of strength that matter, and you have to be able to go up and try to defend your opponents. Their defense in that San Francisco game was abysmal. They couldn't stop the run all season. They couldn't tackle a lot of the season. And I love the idea. Like I said, I love the idea of getting linebackers that can run and hit. Like, they're going to need to – you saw them try to play Deebo Samuel, and you saw them play San Francisco 3 times. They're just out-physicaled, can't tackle. You saw them in that Carolina game against a physical team, and they got run over, and they were pretty embarrassed. And I think that's what you can build. And again, I don't think you can just purely do it with draft picks. And I think you need veterans. And if Deron Payne's the only way to get him is a trade, I think that makes your team so much better. And I'm all for it. I think that would be a very exciting offseason.
It would. It would be. And the only name I wanted to throw your way, Jeff, I was reading this slightly comical article on NBC Chicago, which was suggesting that I think we put this in the 2 + 2 = 5 category. They were suggesting that the Bears would be able to trade for DeForest Buckner because Matt Eberflus was the coach at Indianapolis, and that would be a great reunion. And I read that they were hoping that they could maybe nick him for a 3rd-round pick. And I was thinking, maybe the Rams will give you Aaron Donald for a 4th as well. I mean, there are not many. This is the thing. If you actually go on PFF, there are not many highly graded defensive tackles or interior defensive linemen in the league. There's a very small selection of those who are graded in like the 80s and the 90s, of which DeForest Buckner has consistently been one of them over the last few years. But the one thing I wanted to say is the only way I think he might be available, and he won't be available for a 3rd, but maybe if we're talking about that 2nd round, the one thing that made me sort of just think about it from a Seattle point of view, Jeff, if the Colts are under a lot of pressure. Chris Ballard did a press conference and he was asked over and over again, are you going to trade up? Are you going to trade up from 4? Are you going to go and get the best quarterback? Are you going to go? There's immense pressure on him to get the best quarterback of this draft, or his guy, essentially, because for years it's been Phillip Rivers, Jacoby Brissett, Carson Wentz, Matt Ryan, and the fans are sick of this. They want a good young quarterback. Now, they can get one at 4, presumably, but what if they see it as 2 quarterback draft and they're both gone? You know what they're going to do? They're going to draft a defender. Like they've got to trade up, and the Colts do not have a 3rd-round pick because they're giving it away. So they need a bit more stock in order to be able to confidently move up to Chicago. Would they be willing to sacrifice DeForest Buckner to get draft stock to help them go from 4 to 1, let's say? And would that appeal to the Bears if there's a bit more stock thrown in? Because then they stay in the top 4 rather than, say, trading to 9th with Carolina. I do think there is some benefit to Chicago if they're going defense to saying, we want to go and step, we want to make sure we get Will Anderson or Jalen Carter, let's say. So I just wonder whether the Colts might be willing to sacrifice somebody there to make that deal. And who knows? I mean, DeForest Buckner's 29 this year, so he's a bit older. But again, I listened to Pete Carroll, Jeff, talk about how much they needed impact and factors up front. And you are not going to get impact and factors from rookies, even with the 5th overall pick, not in the first year. And you're not going to get impact and factors by cheap and cheerful free agents. You need blue chip players. And I just get the sense that they're going to have to, they will feel massive pressure. They've been here before. 2019, we've got to fix the pass rush. We've got to fix the pass rush. That amounted to trading Frank Clark and drafting LJ Collier. And the year after it was, we're going to try and keep Jadeveon Clowney. And then, we've not done that. So it's Bruce Irvin and Benson Mayowa. So they've flopped on this before. But the way that he spoke so negatively about what this team doesn't have, it makes me feel they've got to go and do something, Jeff. And they're the only 2. I had a look across every depth chart. They're the only 2 that fit the bill for me, either DeForest Buckner and Daron Payne. Don't know if they'll be available. Don't know what's going to happen with them, but they're the only 2 that I could make an argument for. What do you think?
I think you're right on the money. I got a close friend that's a very big Colts fan in Toronto, and I've probably talked more Colts than I probably should have, considering how boring they've been. So I'm pretty tied into what's going on there. And the one thing he's been telling me for a while now is he's been wondering if they were going to cut or get rid of Buckner because they're in a bad. I don't think they'll cut him, but let me look at his numbers here. He's got no dead money left on his contract, so it would clear out $20 million. And if they're at a point where they acknowledge they're rebuilding and they do have a lot of needs, they don't have a left tackle.
Sorry to interrupt, Jeff. Yeah, they have I didn't realize this. They've got $5 million of effective cap space. Now, I'll have a look while you're speaking to see if there's some easy outs. I suspect people like Matt Ryan will provide that. But so if they cut Matt Ryan, it's an $18 million dead cap hit. But they will save $17 million. And the only other viable one is Buckner, who they saved $20 million from.
Yeah, so he's been putting that scenario to me for a while. I don't think they would cut him outright. I think they'd probably trade him because they probably would be a trade market. But if they're at the point where they determine, okay, they're going to draft a quarterback, they're not in a win-now window with basically, if you get CJ Stroud there, I don't think that team is all of a sudden a Super Bowl contender. They might say, okay, maybe we spend that money on offensive players. They have a shortage of receiver. They traded away a pick for Wentz, and they're going to have to trade to move. they're the obvious trade. They're the mark. Because exactly what you said, Chris Ballard's on the hot seat. Jim Irsay's kind of lost it in the last year. And there's that Buckner contract sitting there and zero dead money. So it's an easy cut. It's an easy trade. And yeah, like me and you have been so critical of how they've handled this defensive line group for so long. And I'm glad it seems like they've finally come to their senses. They've said this before and had idiotic offseason plans. But for years, we've been saying they have no vision. They're tying this together with Band-Aids. This is why I like their last offseason, because it actually made sense. Three of their first 4 picks went to offense. Now it's defense that needs the help. And again, if Buckner becomes available and you can redo his deal, which would drop that cap hit, that's a great opportunity that fits exactly where they are as a team. And I think it's exactly what you said. The Colts are the mark for the trade-up. Unless they drafting a quarterback is not like drafting a defensive tackle. This guy is the face of your franchise. Like, you see what happened with the Jets and Zach Wilson. That OC just got fired because they whiffed. You got a lot of the scouting on quarterbacks happens now. Like, this guy, you have to love everything about him. So the Colts can't just sit there and say, oh, we love 3 quarterbacks. They're going to need to be aggressive. I know they jumped the Seahawks in the draft. That helps a bit, but they can't just sit there 4. They're likely going to have to move, especially Houston in their division would probably love to block them. So I see Buckner as a prime trade candidate. I don't know what it would cost, but he's 29, not 25 like Payne. So I think that does drop the price point a bit. He's a different kind. He's not like the nasty road grader that Payne is. He's more of like a long disruptor. He's like, he can get it, blow up a play very quickly. If you remember how Clowney used to blow up run plays, that's what Buckner can do, and he's a better pass rusher than Payne. So Buckner would be a really interesting guy. He might not fit the timeline of the team if they're putting in a rookie quarterback. So that's where I've been wondering about him as well. A lot of people have been looking at the Bears, but I think you're right. I think the Colts would love to stockpile more assets. They're going to want to move, and they have a lot of areas of need. And Chris Ballard is not in this thing where he can mess around. He doesn't get this right, he's probably going to get released in the next year or two.
Well, I have to apologize to NBC Chicago, because I had no idea that I'm glad you've sort of set the record straight there, Jeff, because I had no idea that the Colts were in this kind of financial quandary. And, it's far from the worst one, but do you know what it reminds me a little bit of? I can't remember how old he was, but I can remember when Calais Campbell went from Jacksonville. He'd had a really good season at Jacksonville. He was about 30, 31 at the time. And I can remember writing articles saying, trade for Calais Campbell, bring him to Seattle. He's got a few years. You're in win now mode. Go and get him. And we were talking back then at like maybe 3rd round picks, late seconds. And then I can remember I was driving somewhere. I was in the passenger seat. My wife was driving, and it buzzed up the Ravens had traded like a 5th round pick for Calais Campbell. And it's like, it cost a 5th? Like that's it? And maybe I'm just misjudging the Buckner situation. Maybe you could get him for a mid-round pick just so they can make that saving and move on, and maybe just get that extra stock so that they can try and trade up. And then you sort of sit there and you think, as you were talking, Jeff, I'm thinking Payne, Buckner, but why not get both? Like that'd be, it's unlikely. You get into a realm of fantasy football, Madden style roster building there. But boy, that'd be I think this is a more interesting thing to talk about than shouting at people because they want to have a conversation about whether to draft a quarterback at 5 or maybe consider Geno Smith's future. I think it's interesting to wonder because you've got the stock to have an influx of talent and add a veteran who can really take you far. So I think that's interesting. I'm going to do an article fleshing out a little bit more. I say it's already done. I may add a bit more on the Colts after this conversation with Jeff. So stay tuned for that as well as for the mock draft. So I want to talk about number 5 overall. Let's just sort of park any dreams of Deron Payne or DeForest Buckner for now. It was 3 right up into the final weekend of the season, and then it drops to 5 in the Colts blowing that game against Houston. I really hope that's not. I hope the player the Colts get, if they stick it forward, doesn't end up being a Hall of Fame legendary player, because that's going to piss me off and everybody else off for the rest of our lives if it is. But what do you think, Jeff? I'm still pretty relaxed about it because I think there are 4 good quarterbacks and 2 really good defensive linemen in this draft. So you're guaranteed at least one of those players at 5. So I'm not worried at all. I'm obviously you'd rather be at 3, but 5, you're still going to get a really good player. I think if you were 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, you'd be a bit more worried. And then we'd be having a conversation about whether you need to take Bijan Robinson or something like that, just for the talent. Thank God we don't have to do that. So I'm okay at 5. What do you think? Because I think that the quarterbacks are flawed in this draft, but I think they're very talented. I remember what people were saying about the Josh Allens and the Mahomeses and the Herberts in the past, and I think it's very similar to what people are saying about the quarterbacks this year. It doesn't mean that they're going to be as good as that, but I think they've got the potential to be that. And it's very difficult to project quarterbacks as it is most positions. So I'm open-minded to them. The people saying that this guy sucks and this guy sucks, which they do a lot on Twitter, I don't buy that. And this is a far better quarterback class than last year. But at the same time, I'm not. If the Seahawks drafted Carter or Anderson at 5, I'm not going to be complain about that. I'd say, okay, fair enough. I'd throw on some highlight tape and enjoy that night watching the highlight tape again of the guy that we've got. So I'm pretty relaxed either way. But what are you thinking?
Yeah, initially I was pretty devastated because that 4th and 20 touchdown was just, and then the Chargers, who end up I don't know what the hell they're playing their starters, and Russell Wilson has this one good game of the year. That was pretty devastating. But the more I've started to think about this deeper, I actually think 5 is a pretty good slot for a couple of reasons. One, I think if you want to take a quarterback, I think it's very possible that one of the 3 best quarterbacks will be there at 5. However, it's also possible if a non-Colts team trades up to 1, then it's possible if, say, you wanted Carter Anderson, if, say, Carolina moves to 1, then that's probably quarterbacks at 1, 3, and 4. So you're getting Carter Anderson. Or you're in the scenario where maybe you're comfortable with Tyree Wilson and someone. I'm not a Miles Murphy fan as well. I'm with you. I think if you're talking about wanting to stop the run and get tougher, that guy does not fit at all. But then I think of the scenario where maybe pick 5 becomes a great trade chip. Maybe you can get, I know people have been saying Dane Brugler did a mock this week where they swapped Carolina and they got 2024-1. Now, I don't know if that's realistic, but you really hold the pivot card. If 2 quarterbacks go in the top 4 and Carter Anderson goes, pick 5 is either the best defender of anyone you want, or you hold the trip of that next quarterback, unless everyone thinks Anthony Richardson's okay. But you really hold a good trade chip. So I think in multiple ways, could be 3 quarterbacks in the top 4. Then you get Carter Anderson. Then you don't have to spend all time debating it. You just get who falls to you. In Arizona at 3, they're a team with a pretty bleak-looking roster. That could also be a trade spot. So everyone's focused on they're taking Carter Anderson for sure. They just got a new GM. They have, other than Kyler Murray and Budda Baker. So I think it's the multiple ways and scenarios you go through this. Maybe if you love Tyree Wilson, then you're securing that you get him. So I think there's multiple scenarios, whether you like a quarterback, whether you want Carter Anderson, whether you want the choice of your next defender or a trade. I think all of those scenarios are pretty good. So a lot's going to change in the next 3 months because a lot of these evaluations, just I was looking at mock drafts from January 2020. Ever since I saw you write that Mahomes thing, I just started looking. I looked at one the other day from Daniel Jeremiah. And last year this time, they had Sauce Gardner going 15th overall. Trevon Walker was going 24th. So a lot of these rankings might change in the next couple months because all we have now is the film, and you've done a great job just keeping us up. There are the lack of blue chip outside of those 2 couple defenders. But I just think when I start going through these different scenarios in my head, I think every one of them pretty much works in the Seahawks' favor. So I think if they ended up at 8, I think that'd be a pretty big bummer, unless you trade it down to 8 and you got a future 1 or another 2 where you can flip it for Payne or something. But I think the Seahawks, I don't know if they'll love Tyree Wilson. I don't know if they'll love, but I think if John falls in love with a quarterback and they're there at 5, I think you have to take them. I just can't help but look at the AFC, see the number 4 teams remaining left. It's Herbert, it's Burrow. No, it's not Herbert. It's Burrow, Lawrence, Allen, and Mahomes. And this team is not built to be bad. So I don't know when's the next chance you're going to get in the top 5. So I think if you fall in love with the quarterback and they're there, you have to take them. But otherwise, I think you're in a good spot where you're going to get a defensive player you really, really like. And he's either the second best player in the draft or the third best player in the draft from a defensive standpoint. So I'm pretty okay with it. I was hurt at first, but I've come around.
I also think, Jeff, in a weird way, it's almost beneficial to let other teams steer you in a certain direction. For example, if you are there at 3 and you've got a load of good options, and then you've got to pick which one of the good options you actually want to go for, you're constantly kind of looking across at that other player who, well, we could have had him. And then if your guy doesn't work out, you're thinking, oh, why didn't we take him? When you're at 5, there's nothing you can do about it. Your options are 2 players fewer, or what? Yeah, 2 players fewer than they would have been if you were at number 3, and you've got less of a choice. So you probably don't spend the rest of the time looking over your shoulder. There may be sort of the one guy that you had left in that group, and if it doesn't go well, at least you can always say, well, whatever. That was who we had to take in that situation. So I don't think it's that bad. I think it's a decent situation. I genuinely think that there are 3 quarterbacks in this draft that look like the kind of player that John Schneider would like. I think that we have to think of it in those terms as well. We have to think of it as who's actually making the decision. And, John Schneider loved Josh Allen. And if Seattle would have taken Josh Allen first overall in 2018, Seahawks Twitter would have had a meltdown. And for the first 2 years of Josh Allen's career, Twitter had a field day with Josh. He was a meme. And if it had taken Patrick Mahomes first overall instead of whoever else in 2017, likewise, people would have gone crazy. What are you taking this guy for? He had 1 million interceptions at Texas Tech. He just throws it around the field. He makes mistakes. He's ended up being, the quarterback of his generation. So I genuinely look at Will Levis and think, he's played in this offense, Jeff. If needs be, he will know the terminology. He would come in. He's the kind of guy that John likes. I think he'd be high on his list. I do think CJ Stroud will be high on his list as well. And I think that Anthony Richardson, for all his supposed rawness, has got a skill set which teams will think, hey, do you know what? With a bit of seasoning, a bit of development, we could turn him into something a bit special. So I think there'll be some appreciation there. But I also think that there's Carter and Anderson. We've had a super chat here, which is an interesting question from Taker610 saying, Rob, have you turned a corner on Carter with his work ethic? I don't know if you've seen some of the videos I've done, Jeff. I picked out an interview that was with Jalen Carter last April, where he was asked in this press conference, Kirby Smart says he wants you to work on your conditioning. What do you think about that? And he basically went, yep, I agree. Conditioning, number 1 priority for me, needs to be better. And then later on in the interview, the press conference, somebody else said, what's the main thing you're working on to improve your game this year? Conditioning. I'm doing runs, I'm doing things that I've never done before to improve my conditioning. And then you watch the games and his conditioning's crap. And he looks exhausted. He admitted he was embarrassed with his performance against Ohio State. He said that. And he had a similar experience against LSU where on the first drive of the game, Jeff, he was blowing out of his arse. It was a long drive from LSU and he looked exhausted on the first drive of the game. And it's a worry for me because you ain't playing 40% of the snaps if you're drafted 5th overall. And that's what he was doing at Georgia, and he's tired. And when Todd McShay was saying there's some character concerns there, people immediately thought that means he's a bad guy. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. And the teammates are coming out saying, what do you mean he's got, look at this charity work he's done, look at this. It doesn't have to be he's a bad person. It could just mean he's lazy, or he doesn't have the stamina or the fitness, or he's not going to live in the gym, or he's not necessarily 100% committed to making sure his conditioning's completely right. Maybe he goes home and sticks the PS5 on and sits there doing whatever these people do on a PS5, Call of Duty or whatever it is, or Madden, I don't know. Eating waffles or whatever, I don't know. That's the concern I have with Jalen Carter. Now, I think if you create an environment, Jeff, where we are going to be a dominant force and we're going to be a pack of dogs like they are at Georgia, I think he'll thrive. I think if you just chuck him in and say, here's Quinton Jefferson, here's Shelby Harris, here's Al Woods, Poona Ford, please make these guys good, I think you've got a concern there. So I'm not against taking Jalen Carter, but I think you have to set up the environment for him to sort of be motivated and to feel like I cannot let Deron Payne down. I cannot let Al Woods down. I've got to come in here and hold my end of the bargain up. I think the environment you bring him into is going to be key, Jeff.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think there have always been, like, watching him, like, gasp for air in those playoff games. It obviously rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. It was the first time a lot of people had seen Jalen Carter who were Seahawks fans. They haven't scouted him all year, and I just know how talented he was. I've been watching him in the second half of the year where he was probably the best defensive player in the SEC, but in that playoffs. So it should worry you that he's only playing 60% of the snaps. And it should worry you that he's, like what you said, you see a video that he wants to improve conditioning, and you're playing for the national championship and he's got conditioning issues. So I think, A, you're going to have to create an environment for him to succeed. I don't think he's like a draw you drop in and all of a sudden everything's fine. I think you're going to have to do a lot of, I think that's where there's no more film left on these guys. These next 3 months are about athletic traits and measurements and really digging into these players. And yeah, they send some scouts out to whoever the guys who scout the South and for the Seahawks are. They probably built up a lot of stuff on him, knowing that they've probably been drafting in the top 5. But this is the time of year where you're going to really need to do your digging on these players and combine interviews, things like that. You're probably going to get a bunch of bullshit, and they're going to be trained by their agents on what to say and stuff like that. So they really got to get a good evaluation done off the field, because you can see what he is with his film, and he's not the perfect player, but he's got the traits that teams are going to fall for. So yeah, I think really putting him in an environment, if he's like treated as like the savior, here's the guy's going to save our defense, I don't know if that's a great way. I think it's like what you said before. You need guys who are going to get him going. The Georgia environment was really, really good for him, being around all these guys. Pete Carroll's typically been good at that, but they've had some black marks with things like that where they've just missed. And they had the Percy Harvin talent evaluation off the field miss. Malik McDowell obviously had the incident off the field, but even his original draft call, the thing they're telling Malik is like, you remember what we talked about? Like, they had to go in there knowing that they're going to take a chance on him with off-field stuff. So that might be a black mark for them because of how badly that blew up in their face. So they got to do a really good scouting job, because there are questions there that are legitimate. It's not just things that's created by the media. There are legitimate questions. Why is he not playing more? Why is conditioning still an issue? And I see the guy you want to build your defense around. So we know the talent's there. We know the traits there, but this is where their scouting and their legwork off the field becomes super critical, because anyone could watch tape and see this guy has talent. It's bigger than that. This guy is a top 5 pick. He's going to be the key player in their defense.
He's a fantastic player. He's exactly what Seattle needs, frankly, and is needed throughout the Carroll era. But I do think he will be there at 5 because of this. I mean, the funny thing in that press conference, Jeff, he even said, I need to work on my conditioning because everyone's telling me I might be a top 10 pick, and I need to make sure that happens. And you're thinking, like, he knew that this was for the money. You know, I needed to go and earn myself, a fortune here, and he didn't get the conditioning right. So when he's paid the guaranteed salary, you kind of think, how's his conditioning effort going to be then? So that's the concept. But he's a massively talented player, and I think if you get him going, watch out. He could be a very good player, but there is a risk element there that I don't think people are aware of. How are you for time, Jeff? There was 2 other things I wanted to ask you about. Are you okay? You're good. So the first thing I wanted to ask was, it's my old, people accuse me of this to be my favorite subject, but it's a Jamal Adams section, I'm afraid. I was again listening to Brock and Solk earlier, and after KJ Wright had been on, there were some very honest opinions from Brock Heward on Jamal Adams, which raised an eyebrow. He went in. I thought they were fair comments, but very honest, saying that, when they traded for him, they wanted the energy that they were lacking from a Richard Sherman and those guys, and the Earls and the Marshawn and people like that. And he says that when he actually got in the building, the energy that he brought was not for the Seahawks. It was for Jamal Adams. It was for himself. And that it was a little bit different than perhaps what they were intending for. And then also when he actually got on the field, it was surprising how weak he was in coverage and the limitations that were there in his game. And now, because he is a player who's played a lot at the line of scrimmage, he's not shown that he can stay healthy. And it was a big concern. And I was surprised that they had this conversation because very few people are willing to have this conversation, Jeff. But they were talking about post-June 1st cut and whether they just need to move on. And it was suggested that you cannot build your defense around Jamal Adams. You cannot bank on him next season. And whether you're better off just cutting your losses, it was suggested that if it wasn't for the dead money, then he would be gone this offseason and it wouldn't even be a second thought. And I think that's probably true. So my question to you, because you have written about the cap this week, is what can we expect? Are the Seahawks just stuck here? Or is there any possibility that they'll go, do you know what? It's just best to draw a line under this in the same way that they did with Harvin and to an extent, your Sheldon Richardsons who they didn't want to keep and people like that. And we just need to get out of this deal because it was alarming to me to hear Pete Carroll say in his press conference that Jamal Adams is not even going to be he's going to still be rehabbing deep into the summer. Like, I don't understand this injury, what it is. Like, it seemed like a really innocuous injury. He was there with the team at the end of the season, but they're saying that he's not like ready and he won't be ready till the summer to like properly start rehabbing. It makes me wonder what kind of shape he's going to be in to start the season. And for me, Jeff, his presence is almost a bit of a meme itself and a bit of a joke. Like it's a failed trade. I personally would love to see a way to just move on and just draw a line under the whole charade and just get some money back and maybe stick that in your defensive and your offensive line. But you've had a look at the cap situation. Let me know what you think.
So there's certainly an option. Like post one June 1st cut clears out $11 million this year. I believe $7 million next year, if that's correct. So it would be spread across 2 years. You have the ability to use two post June 1st cuts. You don't have to wait until June 1st. And if they decide that not going to be healthy to bank on, or it's not worth moving forward, you're going to go in a different direction. Ryan Neal's in our restricted free agent. That is totally feasible. You can do the June 1st cut, clear out $11 million this year, there's $7 million you'll have to take in a dead hit this year, and then pay a little bit next year as well. But that's a very feasible option. I think one thing they could do, and I don't know if they'll do it, but they could try to redo his deal. And I don't know. I think exactly what Brock was saying. I think Jamal's contract was a really thing they did not account for enough. And I know some of the salary cap guys were really critical that they didn't do an extension with him before the trade because that contract was there and it was lingering and it gave Jamal all the leverage that someone traded 2 first-round picks for the guy. So the fact that he came in like that, I think it was a reflection of that contract where he's coming off this value and he's through the moon and he's probably thinking, okay, this is my chance to get paid. And you've pointed out a lot of the things he said and did in those first-year press conferences that were just strange. So, yeah, I heard Salk a bit this morning before KJ came on, and he was saying they should just cut him outright, end this thing. There's no point in moving forward with him. So I think the Seahawks are still a bit in the sunk cost fallacy with him. I still think they want to prove that there's something there. But if they decide otherwise, if they say, okay, yeah, I heard those comments the other day too, and the fact that he's still not close to ready, it's a severe injury, and he's been injured 3 years in a row. Like, you can't count on this guy now. Anything you're going to get from him at this point is gravy. You can't build your defense around him because you don't know what you're going to get. And his skill set is limited. And I know Quandre talks about like the energy he brings, and maybe this has humbled him a bit, seeing that the team kind of had success without him, and the Jets have gone pretty good on defense without him. But if they do decide ultimately they want to move on or they need the money elsewhere, like I would much rather have the $11 million put in the trenches than in an injured safety. And yeah, like that trade we could spend hours on. It was just so bad. It was, every good thing we've said about Russell Wilson, this is the exact opposite. So they probably made the best and the worst trade in the last 5 years. And just when I talked about earlier, like if you'd taken one of those first round picks and traded for a defensive tackle or something, they would have got such a good return out of that, or such a better. And it bothers me that they never really shopped around and they were just so focused on getting superstars for Russell Wilson. They made a mega mistake that they're still paying. And then that contract was even worse. So yeah, I think if they want to go June 1st, I think that's the way to do it. There's room in the cap to make that June 1st cut. You can't trade this guy. There's no one who would take on that deal.
No, I really would just like to move on. And look, it's just, I think you need to draw a line under something sometime, move on. I think it will be almost a bit of a distraction, really. The idea of him coming back and playing at an all-pro level again seems fanciful at best. What kind of shape's he going to be in? If his coverage wasn't great before, what's going to be like now? Is he essentially just going to be a blitz specialist again? I just think he needs a fresh start. Seattle needs a fresh start. I personally would move on. I think it was indicative of a desperate trade, Jeff. I think there was a lot. They've done a lot wrong over the last few years, and we should remember this. That as good as last year was, that was indicative of them failing to upgrade the defense sufficiently in 2020, and it was failing to bring in the kind of characters and the leaders that they wanted, and then just trying to transplant that in to essentially just get a nose job to fix everything, or a boob job. Boob job's probably more apt, really, given the way it's worked out. And you can't do that. And it was so desperation that they didn't have the contract ready, and they just stuck with it. And then Buda Baker signed his contract and reset the safety market. And then somebody else, Justin Simmons, reset it again. It's just a complete shambles from top to bottom. And just, you're better off just going, that's that. Good luck, Jamal, in Baltimore or wherever you're going to go. And we're going to spend that money on the defensive line instead. Seahawks 17 says, need to see Dave Wyman's take on Adams. I am aware of Dave's take on Adams. I've got to know Dave a little bit over the years with his coming to London and Germany and stuff like that. So I do like Dave, so I'm not gonna criticize him, but I do disagree with him on Jamal Adams, and I would move on and I would make the saving. I don't think you can spend $36 million on Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams next year. Well, your D-line's crap. You just can't. Build from front to back on both sides. Maybe even if you don't spend on defensive line, go and get a good guard or a center or something. Like fix the trenches. That's your building blocks. Right. The last thing I wanted to touch on, Jeff, is there was this kind of speculation. We talked about it last time that Pete might retire and all this, and I can't imagine that he's done 2 massive press conferences and then just to say tomorrow that he's retired. That seems ridiculous at this point. But the one thing I do want to ask you about is, it was the Thursday after the last game last year that they had the meeting with Jody Allen. It may have happened already. It might happen tomorrow. It might happen next week. Who knows? It's not guaranteed to be on a Thursday again. But essentially the suggestion from Cal was that everything's staying the same. No changes of staff, no changes of scheme. Nothing's going to happen. Status quo remains. And that's that. And we've all kind of just sort of taken that on face value. Now, if you remember last year, it was run it back. Everything's cool. We played well. Rashad Penny's running the ball. We won games at the end of the year. Let's go. Russell Wilson's not being traded. Staff are all going to be back. Don't anticipate any changes. Week later, Ken Norton's gone. They're trying to court Sean Desai. Russell Wilson eventually gets traded. They switch to a Vic Fangio influenced defense. All hell breaks loose, essentially. So do you think there's any chance that while Pete said what he said, is there a chance that that maybe when they have a meeting, that there will be some changes? And if there are, what would you like to see? I mean, whether it's wholesale, schematic, personnel, ideology, do you think it will be the kind of the meeting that people were suggesting last year, that it'll essentially be a nothing waste of time, crack on, everyone get on? Or do you think there is still room for a bit of drama?
I've been wondering the same thing, but the sense I'm getting from just asking around is that the way the season ended before the playoff game, I think kind of changed the momentum of how people felt about the team. A lot of the Pete conversation kind of went away, even though they barely beat the Rams team, missing like 4 of their best players in Baker Mayfield. And I think based on where ownership viewed the trajectory of the team and how they performed, I think overall it was a pretty positive thing. I think if they had lost those last 2 games in the trajectory they were on in that Carolina game and the Raider game, I think there would have been a lot different conversation. There would have been a lot different of a tone. I think that was almost a bit of a distraction how they beat that Jets because Mike White had one of the worst games I've ever seen. And then they won the Rams and the Lions thing. It all kind of ended the season off in happy fashion before reality hit in the San Francisco game. So my understanding is they have a pretty good understanding of where the team is, and they were set up for this draft, and everything is based on this draft. But I'm hoping Jody's asking about this defense. And I would like to see, like, I was a little disappointed that they're keeping the defensive coaches because the scheme was so awful. And you see it in Minnesota. And I don't know if you saw that Giants-Vikings playoff game. It looked exactly like the Seahawks. And they were actually statistically worse than Seattle on defense this year. With the guy that Seahawks were trying to hire to be the Sean Desai before Desai got here, Ed Donatel. So this scheme, you've been putting out all year, I'm not sure it's like maybe it takes until year 2, or maybe Vic Fangio's the only one who could run it. And Brandon Staley's defense has been up and down. And the guy in the Broncos is running it pretty well, but they got a lot of talent. But yeah, like an ideal world, I would rather see someone, if Pete's going to be more of the CEO style coach, someone who's proven to build a defense. I'd like to see some better direction there. But I just get the sense that ownership is pretty happy where things are going. Obviously, a lot is going to come down to this offseason and how they handle all these resources. Because I was watching the Pete stuff really closely when the wheels were starting to fall off. And I think it was like a deodorant at the end of the year kind of got him off that a little bit. And I think they're going to run it back, but I was honestly surprised to see Pete so honest and upfront about their issues. I was worried, like when you wrote that he was going to come out and say, "Oh, we're just a couple pieces away," and like to hear him a little pissed off and talk about finally like they don't have the talent up front. I'm guessing that came from just talks with ownership, talks with management, and hopefully that leads to something different because they've been so bad at handling that group in the last 6 or 7 years. And we're not saying this in hindsight. Me and you have had that conversation for like 6 years now. So I don't get the sense that much is going to change. I had heard questions about whether Pete and Desai were seeing things eye to eye. There were some questions about, and they were running like multiple defenses by the end of the year. Like they were playing fronts that were more like under fronts, not the typical Vic Fangio fronts, because that was the way to kind of just band-aid how bad their defense was. Obviously it wasn't great, but they really just need to get on the same page. And I don't think they're going to end up firing coaches. I think that would have happened already. So we'll see if I'm wrong. We'll see if things changes. But the sense I get is they're going to go in, they're going to attack this together. They're going to attack personnel, and we're going to see if they can get this right. But they got a lot of things they got to fix, and it's not just players. It's scheme. It's game calling. They're hoping that Clint Hurtt can take a second-year jump like Shane Waldron did, and it's a lot to ask.
I just hope that if there is a meeting, that whether it's Jody Allen or John Schneider, they just say, "Listen, Pete, you've been trying to rebuild this defense since 2018, and every single year the defense is not. It's not even that it's average; it's really bad, especially the last 3 seasons. And you start every year, and you're not average. You don't need to be the 85 Bears, but you can't be the 2020, 2021, or 2022 Seahawks either. This has to be better from the start. And it has to be more consistent, and you have to be trending towards being at least 14, 15, 16th in the league, as opposed to 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, or even worse. And if they are going to get this chance, Jeff, to have a draft class and possibly one of the most important off seasons in franchise history with all these picks and everything, they better bloody get it right. Because if we're sat here and it's a much tougher schedule next year, if we sat here and they've squandered this opportunity, then the next people who come in are going to have to tear everything down, and it's going to have to be. They're going to end up like the bloody Vancouver Canucks if they're not careful. So they don't want to end up in that hole. Trust me. So they better get. I really hope they get this right. But until this defensive staff get their asses in gear, it's hard to be confident about it. And I tell you what, I was reading that article that Vic Fangio had interviewed with the Falcons today, and it made me a little bit jealous because I think if you are going to run the Fangio defense, you better have Vic Fangio running it. And I just thought that had never happened. He wouldn't even take a call from Seattle because he's not coming in here unless he gets complete control over this thing. And he would never get that in Seattle. And it disappoints me that because I would love if you're going to run this system, let the man who knows how to run it expertly run the system. So if it is going to be the same, they better improve. And there's just the thing is, Jeff, is with Clint Hurtt, it's not even like he really developed a great defensive lineman when he was a position coach. There's no sort of I can see why there's something special. I mean, maybe he's just a great leader. I mean, he seems like a very charismatic guy, likable guy to the players. I'm always interested listening to him speak when he's doing the mic'd up sections, but that doesn't mean he can actually coach a defense and lead a defense, call a defense. And really, it's a continuation of bad. Chris Richard didn't work. Ken Norton didn't work. It's 0 for 1 with Clint Hurtt so far. And then you look around the league and you're seeing some of these guys. Brian Daboll's got Wink Martindale as his defensive coordinator. His offensive coordinator is interviewing with the Panthers today or yesterday. He's got the Athletic described it as an all-star staff. And in Seattle, you've got possibly the opposite of an all-star staff. It's just big job for them. And if they're sticking around, they better improve with this draft stock that they've got. One quick final super chat. Jason says there's a fantastic article at Field Goals that accounted for strength of schedule. It concluded we were really a 5-win team because of the quality of the opponents. I'm not surprised by this. You know what? It's actually quite interesting, Jeff. Do you know that the San Francisco 49ers, who are a very good team, obviously a very good team, aren't they? But their strength of schedule this year was 4.17. Now, that might not mean much. It's probably best if I just show everybody this to finish off with, rather than try and read a bunch of numbers out, because it's better illustrated. So you can see San Francisco there. That's their strength of schedule, 4.17. That is the strength of schedule. You can see that there, 4.17. Now look at the rest of the league. You've got like 4.74, 4.53, 0.503, 5.24. There's nothing close to the Niners 4.17. I mean, it's just remarkable how weak. Look at the Bears, 5.571 compared to the Niners 4.17. Now, from a Seattle perspective, 0.462 is one of the easiest schedules in the league. But when you compare it to like Detroit, who had the same record, 0.535, that's a massive difference between Seattle's strength of schedule and the Lions. Ditto with the Giants, who had a much tougher schedule than the Seahawks this year, as did the Washington Commanders, 0.536, and the Jets, 0.538. So it kind of goes to show, Jeff, just to finish on this point, that schedule really matters, doesn't it? I mean, it really matters. And Seattle had a weak one, but unbelievably, the Niners had a schedule for the ages there. They'll never get an easier schedule and perhaps a better opportunity to win a Super Bowl than this.
Yeah, everyone talks about all this roster stuff, and like luck is such an important part of getting to the Super Bowl. And timing and luck, and it's huge. Getting the number 1 seed in the right year, or when Seattle made it the second year, like Arizona had a quarterback injury that faulted them into the first seed in 2014. But like timing and luck is so important in this league. And like we used to spend all that time debating, like, oh, the team were wasting Russell Wilson. Like, why does he only have 1 Super Bowl? Which looks idiotic in hindsight now that we've seen what he's turned into. But so much of the success of a team has to do with timing, has to do with schedule, has to do with who you play. So you really got to be built up to handle those kind of schedules. And years where it's down, you've got to really take advantage, like San Francisco really has over the last 10 and 11 weeks. So Seattle's got to be a better team. They can't just assume because they won 9 games this year, they're going to win 9 games next year. And I'm hoping that internally they see that. But I don't know if that's something they factor in. But yeah, they played the Rams this year without Aaron Donald once. Like if Aaron Donald comes back, that's a totally different. They barely beat them. They won by 3 points, I think, in both games. So they had a lot of things go their way, and they still lost. They went 0-4 against the worst division in the league this year. Like that's pretty embarrassing. They're going to play much harder. They didn't play a lot of great quarterbacks this year too. Who's the best quarterback they played this year? Was it Herbert? Like they.
Probably, yeah. Mahomes, obviously.
Mahomes, yeah. They actually did pretty well against him, weirdly enough. But yeah, they better be equipped to play because you're not going to get a 460 strength of schedule next year. So you're not going to get that most years. So I don't know if 5-1 team is fair because most of those wins came in your division. Like they beat Arizona twice and they beat the Rams twice. They're going to play those teams regardless. So they would have won one more game, and they could have easily won a bunch of games. But Yeah, I think we understand that they were a little lucky. They were 10th in DVOA, but I think mostly that was because of how well Geno played in the first 9 weeks. So yeah, they're not a team that you just can plug and play and you assume they're going to win 9 games and make the playoffs next year. They need work, and it was pretty obvious watching that second half when they weren't perfect like they were in the first half, how quickly it unraveled. So there's no fake hope. Like they should have clear ideas of where their deficiencies are, and they better attack it.
Jeff, it's been a fantastic conversation. Really enjoyed it, and I'm sure everybody has who's been watching as well. And thank you for being so generous with your time once again, and for joining us on this live stream. Jeff Simmons, fantastic to have him with us. Thank you to everybody who has been listening live. Thank you for all of the super chats, and thank you for being with us. Seahawksdraftblog.com for further analysis. If you haven't checked it out, go and watch the Jim Nagy interview that I did this week, and it's full of interesting information about the senior bots on the channel now. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss any of these videos that are coming out. Like this video if you can. Leave a comment in the comment section, even if you've been joining in the live chat. If you can, stick a comment in there. It helps. Make sure you like. Make sure you subscribe. Again, SeahawksDraftBlog.com for more analysis. Mock draft coming up this week, and an article fleshing out all that trade talk about potentially targeting someone like Deron Payne or DeForest Buckner. That's coming up this week as well. So stick with SeahawksDraftBlog.com. Thank you for watching. Until next time.